In this quiet house, a storm was brewing. Behind its white walls lived the woman who would shape and nearly break the man who became America's first president. They called him the father of the nation, but few know how deeply he feared his mother. Her shadow followed him into battle, into power, even into history itself. So what did Mary Ball Washington do to her son? And why did it leave scars he never spoke of? Today, we uncover the story of the woman who raised a president. Before we begin, remember to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already for more videos about amazing stories from history. As a child, George Washington was an energetic, curious, and adventurous kid. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a stern woman with high expectations for her son and all her children. And when I say high expectations, I mean extremely high expectations. She was one of the wealthiest women in Virginia, and when she entered a room, every single person had to bow down to her. And because she came from an old, well-connected family, many people thought that she was perfect. But behind closed doors, she was far from it. I mean, sure, she might have been a good mother to some of her kids, but George wasn't one of them. And here's why. You see, Mary Ball was always busy with her own life and didn't have much time for her son. She left most of the work of raising him to his father, and she paid little attention to how her husband treated him. But what she didn't know was that Augustine Washington wasn't fit to raise a child either. I mean, he wasn't cruel or anything like that, but he just didn't understand children. And he struggled with teaching George manners and discipline. So with his parents too busy to care for him, George ran wild, and he would get into all sorts of mischief. He once let a horse loose inside the house, and another time he chopped down a cherry tree. I'm sure you've heard that story before. However, those stories are just small details compared to the big picture of how George's childhood really was. Because the story that everyone knows, the story of the cherry tree and the hatchet, is a story told by Mason Luck. Weems and T wrote it down more than 100 years after it happened. And there is no proof it ever occurred. But moving back to the present, we know that George was always getting into trouble as a child. And his father was always trying to teach him right from wrong. And even though Augustine tried his best, George still didn't listen. So Augustine decided that George needed a strong female influence in his life to keep him in check. And that's when he asked Mary Ball to take a closer look at her son. Mary saw the kind of young man that George was becoming, and she knew that she had to step up. But instead of trying to talk to him or reason with him like a normal mother would, she began punishing him for everything that he did. And that included things like going outside and exploring. I mean, he was a kid, and it's perfectly normal for him to want to go outside and play. But Mary didn't think so. She wanted him to stay inside and help out around the house. George Washington wasn't the only child that Mary Ball treated this way. In fact, she treated all her kids this way. But it was especially bad for George. And there are many reasons for this. First, he was the oldest. And secondly, his father died when he was only 11 years old. So now, George had to take care of the family and the estate. And he was only 11 years old. I mean, imagine being 11 years old and having to take care of everyone. And not just anyone, mind you, but your mother and your 5 siblings. Yeah, I said 6 children in total. And I'm sure you can imagine how difficult that was for young George. The sad thing is that Mary took advantage of this. She used the fact that George was the oldest to have him do all the work. And because he was grieving the loss of his father, she used that to get him to do even more. She constantly reminded him of how important it was to carry on the family name and make sure their social status remained high. And the only way to do that was to make sure that everyone on the estate ran smoothly. And because George cared about his family and the estate, he worked tirelessly to make sure everything was perfect. This is where his famous work ethic came from, but it also made him miserable. I mean, it's fine to work hard, but when you're doing it because you have no other choice, then it's a whole other story. And to make matters worse, Mary never showed any appreciation for the work that George did. In fact, she only yelled at him and blamed him when things went wrong. Now, all that might sound horrible, and it was, but there were times when Mary was actually proud of her son. When that happened, however, she didn't show it by giving him a hug or telling him how proud she was of him. No, she did it in her own weird way. For example, when George successfully herded a flock of sheep, Mary praised him by saying that he could do anything. But as soon as he stopped working, she would start yelling at him again. This caused George to become withdrawn and depressed. He felt like he could never do anything right, and that his mother would never be happy with him no matter what he did. So he started spending more and more time alone, which led him to develop a love for reading. He would read books about adventure, war, and politics, and they gave him an escape from his miserable life. Unfortunately, this phase of his life didn't last long, because when he was 16, he was sent off to college. This was a huge deal back then, and George was both excited and nervous. For the first time in his life, he would be away from his family and do whatever he wanted. Of course, Mary wasn't too happy about this, but she knew it was for the best. And maybe she knew that she had even been a good mother to him and that he deserved better. But don't worry, because as soon as George left, she began calling him names, like lazy and irresponsible. Now, normally that would upset him, but George had already come to expect it. He attended college for 2 years before returning home, but he would never be the same. All the adventures that he read about as a child were now happening to him, and he couldn't wait to tell his mother all about it. Unfortunately, she wasn't interested, but George didn't care. He was happy to finally be able to tell someone about his experiences, and that's exactly what he did. He told her everything that happened to him in vivid detail, describing all the exciting places he visited and the interesting people he met along the way. Mary sat there listening patiently until George finished. Then she just looked at him and said, "You haven't done your chores yet," and she sent him back to work. George was devastated. He had finally gotten to spend time with his mother, and all she cared about was chores. It was at this moment that George realized that his mother never loved him and probably never would. But that's not all. There was something else she didn't want him to know, something that would change everything. And unfortunately for George, he would soon find out what that was. One night, while George was sleeping in his bedroom, he heard his mother talking in hushed tones. She was in the other room, arguing with one of the servants. George tried to listen intently, but all he could hear were hushed voices. But then suddenly his mom's voice became loud and clear. "If you ever tell anyone what I told you, I will fire you immediately." Then the servant replied, "But Mrs. Washington, I didn't mean to hear it." And Mary screamed, "Good. I hope you never meant to hear it. Now get out." When George heard this, he got up from bed and walked slowly towards the door. As he opened it and peeked around the corner, he saw his mother sitting in a chair with her head down. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and he could hear sniffles coming from her. Carefully, George made his way over to her and asked, "Mother, are you all right?" Startled by his sudden appearance, Mary quickly wiped away her tears and said, "Yes, I'm fine, George. Why are you up so late?" George hesitated for a moment before replying, "I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd come find you." "Oh," Mary said, avoiding his gaze. "Well, go back to bed. George, you have chores to do in the morning." And with that, she dismissed him. Confused and worried about his mother, George returned to his room and went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned for hours, wondering what his mother was hiding. What had she been crying about, and why was she so afraid that the servant would tell someone? Determined to find out the truth, George got out of bed and crept out of his room. He tiptoed down the hallway and peeked around the corner. He could see his mother sitting in the same chair with the same sad look on her face. Mustering his courage, George approached her and asked, "Mother, "Can I talk to you?" Mary sighed and turned to face him. "What is it, George? Can't you see I'm busy?" I just want to know what's wrong," George stammered. "Why were you crying?" A look of pure hatred flashed across Mary's face. "How dare you invade my privacy, boy? I'm your mother. I have a right to demand respect from you." "But," George started, but Mary cut him off. "There's nothing more for you to hear. Now leave me alone." With that, she turned away from him, and George retreated back to his room. He couldn't believe his mother would treat him so badly. For a moment, he considered running away from home, but the thought of leaving his siblings behind stopped him. They needed him, and he couldn't let them down. Instead, George decided to investigate on his own. He began questioning the servants, hoping to find out what his mother was hiding. They were afraid to talk to him at first, but eventually one brave soul revealed what he had heard. "Your mother is terminally ill, George," the servant whispered. "The doctor says she may not have much longer to live." George couldn't believe it. Could his mother really be dying? If so, why had she lied to him? He remembered how she had screamed at him when he asked her what was wrong. Maybe she was ashamed of her illness. But why would she want him to keep it a secret? As George pondered these questions, he made a decision. He would take care of his mother until she passed away. And although she hadn't always been a good mother to him, George believed it was his duty to do everything he could for her. After all, she was still his mother. But as the weeks passed and Mary showed no signs of improving, George began to worry. He knew that he couldn't take care of his siblings in the estate if his mother died. Who would lead the family then? And as George grappled with these thoughts, he didn't notice the evil grin spreading across his mother's face. She was watching him from afar, and she had a plan to ensure that George would take care of her forever. And it was a plan that would make George the man he was destined to be. But to find out what that plan was and how it affected George's childhood, stay tuned for part 2. Now, it is no secret that King George II was not exactly an exemplary parent. Between his adulteries, his general lack of interest in his children, and his apparent inability to deal with them, he was definitely not Mr. Perfect Father. But who was raising the kids while he was off having fun? Well, their mother, of course, Mary of the woman who has been called one of the most hated queens in English history. But how did she manage to raise such horrible children? Was it her fault they grew up so badly? An unhealthy obsession. George, Prince of Wales, was the heir to the throne of Great Britain from the age of 22 until his death at 67. That's right. For nearly half a century, George was the heir apparent. He would attend council meetings and state events with his parents. As he got older, he was given more and more responsibilities, but apparently, all this made him a little too big for his britches. According to his counselors and tutors, the young prince was becoming a bit of a problem, and his mother had to do something about it. But what? Well, enter Bartholomew Russell. Russell was the son of a baron, and he had been friends with King George II since they were young. Now, seeing as the king was his friend, George II naturally thought that Russell would be perfect for the job of tutoring his son. However, some have speculated that Mary had another idea in mind when she put these two men together. You see, Mary had always been obsessed with control, and perhaps she saw Russell as someone she could use to help her control her son. This may seem like a far-fetched theory, but there are some very suspicious coincidences. For example, Russell was known to be incredibly obedient and deferential to Mary, even though he was generally disliked by everyone else in the court. Also, he was around the young prince a lot, even sleeping in his son's bedroom at night. This is where things get really interesting. The stories go that Russell would wake up in the middle of the night and the first thing he would do is to stroke the hair of sleeping George, all the while muttering prayers to God that the boy would grow up to be a good, obedient servant to the queen. If this isn't evidence of Mary putting her son under some sort of psychological control, then I don't know what is. And as time went on, Russell's influence only grew. He eventually became controller of the household and master of the ropes. And when George II succeeded his father as Elector of Hanover, Russell came along, too, traveling with the court to Hanover and acting as controller of the household there, too. Naturally, people started to talk, and many began to suspect that Russell was more than just a tutor and advisor. To George, they believed that he was actually gay and that he was in a relationship with the prince. And while there is no concrete evidence to support this theory, it does seem plausible considering the amount of time the two spent together. Not to mention Mary's possible motive for putting them together in the first place. Bad example. You can say a lot of things about Mary, but one thing you can't accuse her of is being hypocritical. That's because she never pretended to be anything other than what she was. And what she was, above all else, was a manipulator. She knew how to play the game of politics better than anyone else, and she wasn't afraid to use any means necessary to get what she wanted. Unfortunately, she didn't think twice about using this manipulation and deception on her own son, even when he was still very young. From the time he was born, George was destined for greatness. Everyone knew it, and he probably knew it, too. But his mother never let him forget it. She constantly reminded him of the great things he was expected to do, the great things he was expected to achieve. But in doing so, she also instilled in him a deep sense of fear. Fear of failure, fear of letting her down. She demanded nothing less than perfection from her son, but she herself was far from perfect. She had her own vices and flaws, but she never tried to hide them. She was selfish, power-hungry, and ruthless, but she never tried to deny it. Instead, she wore it like a badge of honor, and in doing so, she sent a very mixed message to her son. She showed him that it was okay to be selfish, to be power-hungry, to be ruthless, as long as you were successful. But she also taught him that it was wrong to make mistakes, to be imperfect, to be anything less than perfect. And ultimately, it was this hypocrisy that led to George's downfall. No privacy. It's no secret that King George II was not exactly the most emotionally available father. In fact, most historians agree that he wasn't much of a father at all. He had 17 children, but he never really bonded with any of them. He wasn't interested in their lives or their interests. And he certainly wasn't interested in spending time with them. So it was up to Mary to create the emotional atmosphere in which the children were raised. And what an atmosphere it was. If there was one thing Mary was good at, it was making those around her feel loved and cherished. She was incredibly attentive and nurturing, and she lavished her children with gifts and affection. But this, too, was part of her plan to control them. She knew that if she could make them feel loved and cherished, then they would be more likely to do what she wanted them to do. She would use her attention and affection as a reward, and she would withdraw them as punishment. And it worked, at least for a while. But eventually, her children grew up, and they started to resent her for using them. They felt like puppets, like they were just doing what she wanted them to do, so that they could keep getting the rewards. And in the end, it was this resentment that led to their downfall. Moving on, by all accounts, George's relationship with his father was strained at best. The two men simply didn't get along. And when George was sent to live with his maternal grandparents, it seemed as though the two would never reconcile. But when George's grandfather died and his grandmother became ill, it looked as though Mary would be forced to take her son back, and she was eager to make amends. She wrote to the king begging for forgiveness and offering to give up everything she had ever gained through her marriage to the king, including her title and her seat in parliament, just to be able to have her son back. As you might imagine, the king was shocked by this offer. He had no idea that Mary was so unhappy in their marriage, and he had certainly never seen her as anything other than a loyal and loving wife. But he agreed to the divorce anyway, mainly because he couldn't bear to see his son so unhappy. Playing favorites. One of the most important things any parent can do is show favoritism to their children. After all, It shows them that you love them and that you're willing to give them the extra attention and care they need to succeed. But what happens when you show favoritism to one child over the other? Well, that's what happened in the case of Mary and her children. She had 7 children in total, but she clearly favored her eldest son, George, over the rest. She gave him the best tutors, the best toys, and she made sure he was always involved in court life. Meanwhile, her other children were left to fend for themselves. This created a very unhealthy rivalry among the siblings, and it ultimately led to George being the only surviving legitimate child of Mary and the king. Breaking promises. There's nothing worse than a broken promise, especially when it comes from your mother. When Mary promised her son George that she would always be there for him, he believed her, he trusted her completely. But when his father died and she became queen, she broke that promise. She was too busy with her new role to spend time with her son. She had new advisors and courtiers to entertain, and she had a new life to lead. She broke her son's heart, and she never even noticed. This is one of the most painful things any parent can do, and it's something that George never forgave his mother for. No help. Imagine being the heir to the throne of England and living in a palace with your parents. You would have everything you could ever want, right? Well, not George. His parents were too busy with their own lives to help him with anything. They didn't help him with his homework. They didn't help him choose his clothes. They didn't even help him pick a bride. George was on his own in more ways than one. And this is one of the most important lessons any child needs to learn, how to rely on himself. But George wasn't ready for this lesson, and he struggled mightily. But his parents refused to help him, even when they could have easily done so. They were too busy playing politics or having affairs to care about their son's problems. And this created a monster. All about me. Mary was the kind of person who always put herself first. When she was younger, she was considered the most beautiful woman in the court, and she knew it. She used her beauty to get what she wanted, and she never felt bad about it. She was also incredibly vain and self-absorbed. She would spend hours every day primping and preening, and she would never listen to anyone who tried to tell her otherwise. Her whole world revolved around her, and she expected everyone else in her orbit to do the same. And this attitude permeated every aspect of her life, including her relationship with her son. She had high expectations of him, but they were always centered around how he could benefit her. She wanted him to become king so that she could have a son to rule at her side. She never once stopped to ask what he wanted or what he needed. Smothering. Mary was a very religious woman, and she wanted her son George to be religious. She hired him the best chaplains, and she made sure he attended church every Sunday. But she took things a step too far when she tried to force him to convert to Catholicism. George was a Protestant, and he had no intention of changing his religion. But his mother didn't care. She wanted him to convert so that she could keep him under her thumb. She knew that a Catholic monarch would be beholden to the Pope, and she wanted that power. Unfortunately, she never realized that this was one battle she wasn't going to win. George was a strong-willed man, and he wasn't about to change his religion just to please his mother. And coming in at no. 1. Keeping him close. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. Mary was incredibly controlling. She couldn't stand the idea of her son growing up and leaving her, because that meant he would be out of her control. And she wasn't ready to let that happen. She kept him close to her for as long as possible, and she never gave him the chance to strike out on his own. This was the ultimate betrayal of motherhood, and it was something George never forgave her for. Now it's time for you to tell us what you think. What was the most shocking mother of control fail of Mary II? Let us know in the comments below. Broken, battered, bruised and bleeding, yet with an exhilaration only youth can know. He stood there watching the last of the redcoats ride over the brow of the hill and disappear from view. Alone, now in the gathering gloom, he looked down at the blood staining his shirt and grinned. Finally, it had happened. Finally, he was free of his mother's apron strings. Finally, he could be on his own, carve out his own destiny. He was 19 years old. His name was George Washington. The year before, he had been a mama's boy, but now he was ready to take on the world. The problem was, his world was 200 miles away across some of the most God-forsaken wilderness this side of the Atlantic. And his mother, she lived 200 feet away in the house behind him. All his life, his mother, Mary, had doted on him, smothered him, controlled him, made sure that he never had to experience anything remotely resembling hardship. That all changed when he turned 13. That was when Mary had decided that her darling boy needed a purpose in life. A purpose that would take him away from her, away from home, away from everything familiar and comfortable. A purpose that would require him to leave home and join the hated British Army. At first, George had resisted. But the more Mary talked about her dream for him, the more she painted pictures of the glorious life that awaited him. As a soldier in the British Army, the better he performed, the higher he might climb, the more influential he could become. In time, he could even lead the army himself. He could go down in history. All he had to do was sign on the dotted line. But even then, she hadn't let him join up. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, she made him wait 6 months, during which time he worked like a dog. He chopped wood. He dug ditches. He fixed fences. He weeded the garden. If she caught him wasting time, daydreaming, or just sitting around, she would scream at him. She told him he was lazy, that he was wasting his life. He couldn't do anything right. But after 6 months of back-breaking work, when he was fit and lean and strong and she knew that he wouldn't break under pressure, she finally gave him what he wanted. Not only did she sign his papers, she made sure that his uniform arrived 2 weeks early, so that he could parade in it. Now, standing there, battered and bruised, he realized that she had been wrong. All those months of hard labor had not prepared him for what he'd just experienced. The reality of war was brutal. Life as a redcoat was hell on earth. There were no glorious victories, no promotions, no exciting adventures. What there was, however, was disease, starvation, cold, mud, and death. In the end, it hadn't taken much to break him. When the colonel discovered his stash of contraband tobacco, he'd confiscated it, thrown him in the guardhouse for a week, beaten him, and fined him 20 pounds. Now, owing more money than he earned in a month, he'd been forced to smuggle again. And when the sergeant spotted him, he'd been given a choice. Either walk out with his head held high and be branded a coward, or stay and take the punishment. It hadn't been difficult to choose. Shame was preferable to pain. He'd walked out, and now he was done. Done with the army, done with his life as a soldier, done with his mother's plans for him. He took a deep breath and started walking. Mary would be furious, but he didn't care anymore. It was her fault he was in this mess anyway. Had she pushed him enough, maybe he'd have stayed in. Had she not been so bloody-minded about the whole thing, maybe he'd have been able to handle it. But now he was leaving, and she would pay for it. As he climbed into the saddle and spurred his horse forward, the last rays of the sun glinting off his polished breastplate, he felt free. Free to forge his own path in life. Free to find his own glory. Free to become the man he was meant to be. Meanwhile, Mary was writing a letter. She sat at her desk, a quill scratching furiously across the page as she poured out her heart to the one person who could help her. She wrote of her son's disobedience, of how he'd run away, of how she'd tried to guide him, to help him, but he wouldn't listen. She knew that he was a coward. She knew that without her behind him, propping him up, keeping him honest, he would never amount to anything. But she also knew that her husband, his brother, and her sister's husband, well, they would see things differently. They would understand that George was merely a boy and that the army had been too much for him. They would help her bring him back, make sure that he understood what a mistake he'd made. She finished the letter, sealed it, and then went to the window. From here, she could see the road leading to the ferry. All she had to do now was send a rider to overtake George, tell him to stop, bring him back. Oh, she would fix this. She always did. This time, though, something told her that it wasn't going to be so easy. The next morning, her husband, Lawrence, found her kneeling beside the fireplace in the drawing room, praying. When she looked up, he could see tears streaming down her face. He knelt beside her and put his arm around her shoulder. Then he got up and went to the window. Below, servants were readying the carriage. A fresh horse had been put in harness. It snorted impatiently as it shifted from foot to foot. This? Lawrence picked it up, read it again, then handed it back to her. "You shouldn't have written that," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered, burying her face in her hands. "But I have to do what I can. I won't stand by and watch him throw his life away." Lawrence didn't reply. He knew his wife. Once she set her mind to something, nothing could change it. And while she might be wrong, he couldn't deny that he was proud of her strength. He got up, straightened his breeches, tucked his shirt into his waistcoat, brushed the crumbs from his clothes, then took her hand. "Then let's go and get our boy back," he said. "We'll go to Williamsburg. We'll speak to his brother and see if he can talk some sense into him." She nodded, but it was too late. Too late because as Lawrence and Mary drove towards Williamsburg, George rode through the night. He slept little and ate less. Every mile he put between them was a victory. Every hour he stayed away was a defeat for his mother. By the time Lawrence and Mary reached the ferry, the innkeeper confirmed that George had passed, but he couldn't say where he'd gone or in what direction. To catch up with him, they would need to follow him across the river and on into the unknown. When they told the colonel, he was surprised. "George is an excellent lad," he said, "and full of promise. He's a credit to you, Mrs. Washington." Mary forced a smile, but inside she was furious. This was her chance to get George back, to put things right. And this fool was making it harder than it needed to be. "Then you must tell me where he's gone," she said, "so that I can go and fetch him back." The colonel shook his head. "No, ma'am. That's not possible. Not without a warrant." She stared at him, willing him to change his mind, but he wouldn't budge. And so she was forced to write another letter, this time to her sister's husband, begging him to come to the rescue. Only one problem. He was on a long weekend visit to his own mother, 200 miles away. Even if he got the message, it would take him a week to arrive. Alone now in the gathering gloom, he looked down at the blood staining his shirt and grinned. Finally, it had happened. Finally, he was free of his mother's apron strings. Finally, he could be on his own, carve out his own destiny. He was 19 years old. His name was George Washington. The problem was, his world was 200 miles away across some of the most God-forsaken wilderness this side of the Atlantic. And his mother, she lived 200 feet away in the house behind him. He pulled his horse to a halt beside a farmhouse, tied him up outside and went inside. A fire burned merrily in the hearth. A woman stood up from behind the table. She smiled at him. "Can I help you?" she asked. He nodded and gestured to his leg. She understood. With a grunt, she beckoned him closer. "What brings you here, son?" she asked as she washed the wound. I ran away," he stammered, suddenly ashamed of the bravado he'd displayed just hours before. The woman stopped what she was doing, looked him up and down. "You're all grown up then," she said. "Your mother sent me word you might drop by. She's worried sick." George's heart sank. Of course she'd told everyone. Why had he been such an idiot? He should have known better than to trust her. "Tell her I'm fine," he said. "Tell her I'm all grown up." He might have been trying to convince the woman, but in truth, he was convincing himself. His mother might think that she knew what was best for him, but he had a purpose now. He would succeed or die trying. He was on his own. That night, lying in a straw pallet in the corner of the barn, listening to the wind howling through the cracks in the wood, he wished he'd stayed in the army. At least there he'd had friends. At least there he'd had someone looking out for him. The next morning, he woke up stiff and aching. But as he brushed the dirt off his clothes and walked into the farmhouse, he knew that he was ready to try again. Ready to start a new life, a life without his mother. "Oh, my love, my very dear George, it's me, Mary. I hope that you receive this letter whilst you're on your journey to the new world. I know that it's against orders for us to be corresponding like this, but I couldn't bear the thought of you sailing across the ocean without knowing how much I miss you already. You left only 2 weeks ago, and it feels as though an age has passed since we last saw each other. Every night I dream of being with you again, walking hand in hand through the streets of London and laughing together as we watch the world go by. But when I wake up in the morning, you're not there to hold me or tell me that everything is going to be all right. And so I write these forbidden letters to you under the cover of darkness, hoping that they will reach you before dawn. I am sorry about what happened the other day at your brother's house, but I simply could not bear to hear him speak of you and the new world in such a disrespectful manner. It's clear that he still harbors resentment over the way that our relationship ended, and that he blames you for causing him to lose me. Well, if he only knew the truth. But then again, why should I tell him? It was a foolish, reckless, passionate thing that we did, something that needed to be kept secret, hidden away forever. William doesn't need to know any more than he already does, especially now that you are off fighting a war on the other side of the world. The last thing that I want is for him to think that I would throw myself into danger on purpose, that I would willingly put myself at risk. He needs to believe that I'm safe here in England, tucked away in a little cottage, far from the horrors of war. And please don't worry about me, my love. I know how much you care about me, but I am perfectly safe here. I have everything that I need. And besides, it's not as though the French and Indian War can possibly affect me here in England. No matter how many battles are fought or how many men die, all that is so very far away. It cannot touch me. That is, of course, unless you're injured or killed. God forbid I ever speak such a thought aloud. But sometimes I do wonder if I made the right decision in letting you go. You were willing to sacrifice everything for me, to give up your life in England and start a new one with me in the new world. And now you're off fighting a war that neither of you wanted. Because of my brother, I could have stopped it, should have stopped it, but I didn't. And now I fear that I may never see you again. I received a letter from your mother just the other day, and she told me that you were due to leave shortly, that you would be sailing soon for North America and for the theater of war. At first, I was afraid that you had come to fetch me, that you were leaving England because you had decided that we could no longer stay apart. Then my heart sank like a stone as I read on and realized that you were going to fight against the Indians, the very people who saved my life and gave me a home when I had nowhere else to turn. If you could only see me now, I would show you the necklace that they gave me. This pendant that I wear around my neck every single day, even when I sleep. It's a token of their gratitude, a reminder of the kindness that they showed me when I was nothing but a scared and helpless child. They took me in, they loved me, and they taught me everything that I know. How could I ever repay them for all that they've done for me? By watching you kill them? Never. My love for you is stronger than my love for my country. I choose the Indians, the forest, the wilderness, over England and everything that it stands for. Oh, George, I'm so torn, so confused. I feel as though I'm living two different lives, not just in reality, but inside my own head as well. I walk around London like a ghost, always looking over my shoulder, never knowing who might recognize me or discover my true identity. If anyone knew that I was once the adopted daughter of the great chief they Indonesia, they would either mock me or imprison me, perhaps both. So I keep it a secret, along with everything else that I have done, everything that I am becoming. I hear the drums beating in the distance. Oh, my love, the drums of war are calling you away from me, and I fear that this is a goodbye. I wish that I could go with you, to fight by your side, to defend the Indians against those who wish to destroy them. But I cannot. I must hide in the shadows and wait until it is all over. Until then, I'll be here waiting for you, hoping that you'll return to me safely, praying that you won't look at me in disgust when you find out what I have become. In the darkest hours of the night, when the moon is full and the wolves are howling, I take the pendant from around my neck and hold it in my hands. It's the only thing that I have left of my past life, the only thing that connects me to the tribe that raised me, to the people who I call my family. Oh, George, if only you knew the truth, if only you knew what I've done, who I really am, would you still love me? Would you still hold me in your arms at night and tell me that everything was going to be all right? Or would you push me away and tell me that I am nothing but a monster? Don't misunderstand me, my love. I know that what I've done is wrong, that I have caused nothing but pain and misery. But I couldn't help myself. I had to get revenge on William. I had to make him suffer for what he had done to me, for what he had taken from me. And in the end, it wasn't just William. I wanted to hurt anybody who had anything to do with my rejection. Anybody who had treated me poorly or abandoned me when I needed them the most. That's why I'm here in England, hiding in the shadows, pulling strings, watching as my enemies destroy themselves. Oh, George, I never meant for things to get this far. I never meant for people to die, but it's too late for that now. There is no turning back. And so I do the work of the devil, all for the sake of love. Yours truly, Mary. My very dear George, it's me. Mary. I trust that you're well and that you've had an uneventful voyage so far. Please disregard the previous letter. It seems that someone has gotten into my things and taken my journal. They've written horrible, wicked things, trying to turn you against me. Whoever did this obviously hates me and wants to break us apart. Just know this, my love, I would never do anything to hurt you or put you in danger. I never wanted William to die, nor any of the others who fought against the Indians. I could never be responsible for the deaths of innocent men, nor would I ever dream of hurting you. I know that you're fighting a hard battle, that you're facing terrible things that no man should ever have to see. But I also know that you're strong enough to overcome them. Just hold on to that thought, to that belief, and you will survive. You have my word. Whenever you feel afraid, whenever the darkness threatens to consume you, close your eyes and think of me. Think of me and the life that we could have had. Think of me and the baby that you're going to have. And suddenly it will be as though you're back in England with me, safe and sound. Just hold on to that thought, George, and you will pull through this nightmare called the French and Indian War. With all my love, Maryps. This letter is to be given to Colonel Washington. Should you meet him on your travels, please let him know that I said hello, and tell him that I'm waiting for his return. As the messenger approached, his face pale and drawn, he could see that something was wrong. He could tell by the set of his shoulders, the way that he held himself, the way that he looked at him, as though he were a snake about to strike. Then he felt the tremor in his hands as the letter was placed in his hands. It was sealed with red wax, marked urgent, and bore his name in flowing script. He turned it over, looked at the messenger and asked, "Tell me, boy, did His Royal Highness dictate this letter himself?" "Yes, sir," replied the messenger, and he sounded proud to have been chosen to deliver the message in person. "He sent me with it, but he said not to open it until I had delivered it." "Very well then," said George, pocketing the letter without another word. "You may be dismissed." As soon as the door had closed behind the messenger, George sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, his mind racing. What could his father want with him at this hour? Why had he sent for him if he didn't want him to read the letter before delivering it? Hadn't he always been honest with him? What if there was something in the letter that he didn't want him to see? Suddenly, he was on his feet, pacing the room like a caged animal. Could he refuse his father's request? Could he pretend that he hadn't received the letter? The answer, of course, was no. He couldn't do that to his father. Whatever was in the letter, he would read it, but he would read it alone. All right, it's time for another installment in the series. And this is a story that I have been dying to tell for a long time, because we finally have some pretty good primary sources for it. So buckle up, ladies and gentlemen, because this is going to be one hell of a ride. I know there is a lot of people who are disappointed that Deborah Sampson is UNT in the Assassin's Creed game, but honestly, if they had her in the game, she probably would have been one of the worst characters in the game. You know, it's a historical fiction game, so they always have to kind of dumb down the characters a little bit and make them fit into their little narrative. And personally, I think she'd probably end up being one of the worst characters in the game, just based on everything we know about her. Like she was a very hot-headed woman and not really that intelligent. I mean, she wasn't necessarily book smart, but street smarts, definitely not. But anyway, I got off on a tangent. This video is about Molly Pitcher, not Deborah Sampson. George and Molly had been married for about 6 years by 1776. And at this point in their relationship, it was not going well. George was an ever drunk, incompetent, angry man, and Molly had started having affairs. Now, whether or not these affairs were with men that were higher ranking than George, or just other soldiers in the Continental Army, we don't know. But we do know that she slept around a lot. She had quite a few affairs while George was off fighting in the Revolutionary War. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, Molly didn't really want George to go to war. She thought that he was making a big mistake. But when he did, she decided to follow him and she became a camp follower. Now, Molly wasn't the only one following George. There were 2 women who followed him, actually, because Mary, his sister, decided that she was going to join in on the fun, too. Mary was younger than George by 4 years. She was born in 1754, and although she was born in New Hampshire, she spent most of her life in Massachusetts. When the war broke out, Mary was living in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, with her husband and their 3 children. And when George joined the Continental Army, Mary decided to join him, along with Molly, her sister. The problem was she didn't have any particular skills, so she didn't know what the hell she was doing. At first, she tried to nurse the sick and wounded, but she was terrible at that. And then she tried working as a laundress, but she was even worse at that. So she ended up just hanging out in the camp, basically leeching off of the other camp followers, trying to make the best of the situation. In hindsight, maybe she should have used the situation to her advantage. You see, there was a huge shortage of supplies in the Continental Army, especially food. And when there's a shortage of supplies, prices go through the roof. If you could figure out a way to get your hands on a large quantity of goods and bring them into the camps, you could make a fortune. Most of the contractors in the Continental Army were supplying food, things like that. But someone who specialized in propaganda, someone who could spread rumors throughout the colonies, that was a very valuable commodity, and Mary never capitalized on that opportunity. She could have been the person who convinced people that Benedict Arnold was a traitor before he even defected to the British. She could have been the one who caused the panic that led to the Danbury raid. She could have been the one who turned the public against Major General Charles Lee after his court-martial, but she never took advantage of her position. She was useless. Mary stayed with the army from 1776 to 1780, which was longer than most of the enlisted men. And it wasn't because she was a badass, capable woman who made a valuable contribution to the military. It was simply because she had a brother-in-law who was in charge of supplying the army. So, whenever she wanted food, all she had to do was ask George to use his influence to get it for her. And when she wanted to go somewhere, all she had to do was ask George to use his influence to get her there. In essence, Mary never had to worry about anything. She lived a cushy life as a camp follower. And what is interesting about that is that there is a myth that persists to this day that Mary was some sort of spy. Some people say that she was a British spy, and others say that she was a spy for George Washington. We even have historians who claim that she was a double agent, working for both sides at different points in the war. Now, where exactly this myth came from, I have no idea. I mean, Mary wasn't even capable enough to be a simple spy. I mean, it's hard enough to keep secrets in normal circumstances. But how are you gonna keep secrets when you're constantly asking your brother-in-law for food and favors? I mean, common sense would tell you that somebody who has to ask for everything they need is unnecessarily somebody who is capable of keeping secrets. I mean, let's be honest. If George knew that Mary was spying on the British, he probably would have killed her if he caught her. The sad thing is, there was a rumor going around at the time that Mary was sleeping with George Washington. And if she could have used that rumor to her advantage, she might have actually been able to survive. You see, there was a group of women in Philadelphia that had been hired by the Continental Congress to spread propaganda. They were called the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia, and they were responsible for turning public opinion in favor of the war. And every single member of this association believed that George Washington was the greatest man alive. They practically worshipped the guy. So if Mary wanted to convince these women that she was having an affair with Washington, she would have gotten all kinds of financial support from them. Unfortunately, though, she never did that. She just stayed in the army as a camp follower, and because she was so lazy, she ended up having to move in with Molly and George in 1780. See, George had been drinking heavily and had developed a serious case of gout, and since he couldn't work anymore, Molly went to North Carolina to try to drum up business as a camp follower. And since Mary was too lazy to find her own place to live, she ended up staying with them in their home. While she was living with them, George was sent back to New England to recruit troops, and Mary, ever the opportunist, seized this as a chance to turn public opinion in her favor. When George left, she began writing letters to newspapers and magazines, claiming that she was a war widow, that her husband had died in battle, and in these letters, she would beg people to send her money so that she could survive. Here's one example of a letter she wrote to a magazine called the Massachusetts Magazine. She said, "Mr. Editor, as your paper comes into camp, I hope you will excuse a pen that has not before been dipped in ink. My husband, John Brown, died in battle near New York in the year 1779. He left me and 3 small children without any property, but I have now wearing as the warmest cloak I have is but a thin wool one, not fit to travel in, and knowing no other way to procure relief." Okay. How do you think that one's gonna play out? She literally just asked them to send her clothes because she was cold. I mean, come on. Mary, at least have the decency to pretend like you're cold and also need money. Don't ask for clothes. Everyone knows that widows and orphans are supposed to be paid. If you want money, say that you need money. But asking for clothes? What, are you stupid? But amazingly, this plan worked. People all over New England sent her clothes, food, money, blankets, and even offered her jobs. She was paid to give lectures about her experiences as a soldier's wife. And believe it or not, people showed up to listen to her. She was that much of a piece of shit. But just as Mary's career as a pseudo-war widow was taking off, George returned from the war. And when he got back, he found out that Mary had been telling everyone that he was dead. Now, keep in mind, at this point in time, George had no idea that Benedict Arnold had betrayed him and led the British to West Point. George had no idea that the war was coming to an end. So when he returned home and found out that Mary had been telling people that he was dead, he was furious. He confronted her and demanded to know why she had lied about him. And Mary, being the manipulative bitch that she was, played the victim. She told George that she had no choice but to lie about him. "See," she said, "I had to do it to survive, George. You were gone, and I needed to take care of myself. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Sit around and starve to death?" And George, being an ever-drunk, dim-witted man, fell for it. He felt sorry for her and allowed her to continue living with them. And this arrangement lasted until 1783, when George finally got his pension. And you won't believe what he demanded in exchange for it. We've seen the story of George Washington 1,000 times, or at least we think we have. But what if there were more to the tale? What if I told you that after his death, there was a woman who wanted to take the throne in his place? And she wasn't just some distant relative with a weak claim to the title. She was his widow. Let's get into it. This is the story of Martha Washington, the widow who wanted to be queen. For over 20 years, Martha Washington had been the First Lady of the United States, hosting parties, managing households, and generally being a gracious and elegant hostess for her husband, President George Washington. The country had just emerged from a brutal war against the British, and she and George had spent much of their time since then celebrating victories and healing wounds. There were parades and balls and barbecues, all designed to bind the new nation together after so much bloodshed. But now, less than 2 months before George's death, Martha was getting ready to host one final party, a sort of victory lap, to end all victory laps. And the guest list would read like a who's who of the newly formed United States. There would be John and Abigail Adams, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, as well as the governors of every state in the Union. All of them would come pouring into Mount Vernon for a 3-day festival of food and drink. Martha went all out. There were fireworks and horse races, and even a mock battle between a group of young men and a handful of enslaved people. It was 4 days of celebration, and not a single guest paid a cent for anything. For Martha, this last hurrah was a chance to show off everything she had learned during her time as First Lady. A chance to demonstrate to the entire country what she believed a president's wife should be like. When it was over, her guests departed, exhausted but satisfied, leaving behind glowing reviews of Martha's cooking, her grace. Even James Madison, who would soon replace George Washington as president, praised her to the skies. "Mrs. Washington's management of these public duties has given the highest satisfaction," he told a friend back home. "Her manners are easy and elegant. Her conversation is lively and well-informed." But Martha knew those compliments weren't really for her. They were for George. See, she understood that her role as First Lady was merely an extension of her role as President's wife. And the one thing every president's wife had to do was make sure everyone thought her husband was doing a great job. She was his accessory, a trophy wife whose only real duty was to stand by her man and look pretty while he did the hard work. She'd played the role well, Martha thought, and now it was time for her to take a bow. She began writing letters to various influential people around the country, asking them to come to Mount Vernon for one last big bash. This time it would be in her honor. After all, she figured, she had earned it. And that's when things took an unexpected turn. See, when Martha was planning her party, she hadn't counted on the other Mrs. Washington. You see, after George died, Martha would become the richest woman in America. His estate was valued at over $500,000. which would be like getting $3 million in today's money. And she was about to add another $500,000 to that by selling a bunch of the family's land. But Martha wasn't interested in amassing a fortune. She just wanted to stay famous. She wanted to be remembered as the first lady, the woman who had helped run the country for 8 long years. So as the party invitations went out, she also began writing letters to newspapers around the country, suggesting that George Washington had actually died penniless, and that his widow was having a hell of a time trying to keep the family afloat. "My dear sir," she wrote to one editor, "Mr. Washington has left no money behind him except what is absolutely necessary for my support and that of my 2 little grandsons. I am therefore reduced to want and must endeavor to get a livelihood for myself and my grandchildren by disposing of the little property which the hands of industry and parsimony have acquired. As you can probably tell, this is not how history remembers Martha Washington, nor is this the type of story most people know about her. In fact, it might sound a bit ridiculous. Surely the richest woman in America didn't need to beg in newspapers for people to give her money, right? Well, maybe she did, because when the invitations to her party went out, the public responded with a resounding yawn. Martha Washington, it seemed, wasn't nearly as beloved as George Washington. She got a few sympathetic letters from rich widows offering her money and condolences, but that was about it. Nobody showed up to her party. No politicians came to pay their respects to the former First Lady. No famous generals made an appearance. Only a handful of close friends and relatives showed up to say goodbye. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was Martha Washington, I would have been pretty upset at this point. Not only had I lost my husband and my social standing, but nobody even cared enough to show up to my going away party. I think I'd be feeling pretty depressed and maybe even a little angry. But that's not what Martha did. Instead, she decided to double down, to make sure that even though her party had been a failure, she would still get her moment in the sun. You see, as Martha saw it, the problem wasn't that she wasn't important. It was that nobody else knew she was important. Sure, she couldn't force people to show up to her party, but she could force them to hear her out. She took to the newspapers again, this time publishing a letter she had written to a friend. In it, she lays out her grievances, explaining that she is poor and lonely, and that nobody in the country cares about her or her 2 young grandsons. She goes on to say that she doesn't know what she'll do when winter comes, saying, "I have already begun to feel the severity of winter and am apprehensive it will be too great a hardship for me to bear alone." She concludes by saying, "If I had the pleasure of seeing you here, I would feel less lonely. Though I dare not indulge the hope of it, as I have heard you are engaged in a tour to the southward." And there you have it. Martha Washington, poor widow, begging for sympathy. In hindsight, I probably wouldn't have done that either. But Martha wasn't trying to win the sympathy of the American public. She was trying to win their respect. See, she realized that George had become a demigod in American lore. There were already books and paintings and statues being made about him. And if she wanted to keep people talking about George Washington, she needed to insert herself into those stories. If Martha was George's accessory while he was alive, she was determined to be his accessory in death as well. Now, the question was, how could she do that without looking pathetic? Well, she took a page out of Cleopatra's book, deciding to put on one hell of a show. She staged a series of public events at Mount Vernon, inviting whoever she could to come watch her grieve. First, she had a funeral procession for George, complete with a full military escort. Then she hosted a party for the soldiers who had guarded his body after he died. Finally, she invited the press to come watch her light the funeral pyre that would consume George's wooden coffin. Each event was meticulously planned, designed to evoke the proper amount of grief and awe. And each event was open to the public, free to attend. Martha knew that if she played her cards right, she could become an integral part of George Washington lore. The tragic widow who had lost her beloved and was now cremating his remains. It was the perfect story. And then something unexpected happened. The local newspaper published it. The next thing Martha knew, the story of her elaborate funeral and cremation ceremony was in the hands of thousands. Every detail she had so carefully orchestrated was now out for the world to see. And that meant one thing: she would finally get her party. Thousands of people showed up to Mount Vernon to console the grieving widow, many of them bringing gifts of food or money or clothes. There were church services and parades, and even a play performed in Martha's honor. It was everything she had hoped for and more, but it wasn't exactly the kind of attention she was looking for. See, the newspaper had also published her letter detailing her financial struggles, the one where she claimed that George had died penniless. And that created a problem for Martha's plans to monetize her status as First Lady. As it turned out, George Washington hadn't died penniless. He had, in fact, left behind a considerable fortune, and Martha was doing quite well for herself. So Martha had lied, and now she needed to fix that. She started writing letters to newspapers around the country, refuting her claims about being poor, but it was too late. The damage was already done. And just like that, Martha Washington's bid to become queen was over. George Washington's widow had become a national laughingstock. But there was one small glimmer of hope. The newspapers still talked about her in glowing terms, praising her for her charity and her grace and her poise. Maybe it wasn't so bad to be a footnote in George Washington's story after all. When we think of the life of Martha Washington, we generally think of her in the context of her marriage to George. She was a young woman who married a somewhat older man, bore him several children, and then outlived him by several decades. In the grand scheme of things, she is not thought of as an especially interesting or powerful person, despite being the first Lady of the United States. However, there is one other woman who is very important in George Washington's life, and had an even greater impact on him than Martha did. Unfortunately for her own legacy, she is best remembered as the mother of George Washington, a title which is really unfair to her because Mary Ball Washington was actually a fairly fascinating individual with quite a bit more to her than just that familial connection. So let's talk about her, because it's me. Welcome to the channel. This episode is part of our series about the mothers of famous people. You can find more information below if you would like to check out more episodes. This content is brought to you thanks to my generous patrons. If you would like to help support this channel, please consider becoming a patron. Mary Ball Washington died on August 25, 1769. At the age of 53, the cause of death is unknown, but she had been suffering from poor health for some time, and was certainly in need of rest when it came. But sadly, this peace was not granted to her. On the day of her passing, George was in Boston negotiating terms for ending the French and Indian War, a conflict which he saw as a means to establish his military career. And so, he wasn't able to attend her funeral. He sent his condolences and contributions towards a monument to be erected in her honor, but he didn't even receive word of her death until 2 months later, when he eventually returned home to Ferry Farm in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He found that his father had used her coffin as a work table, and that his siblings had used the velvet from it to make clothes for themselves. It was clear that she was not greatly missed by them. What kind of woman was Mary Ball? How could she have been so important to George while simultaneously meaning nothing to anyone else? Well, for starters, Mary Ball was no ordinary woman. She was born into wealth and privilege, and spent her childhood traveling Europe with her family. She was well educated, an accomplished musician, and a person of high culture. While living abroad, she met and fell in love with a wealthy plantation owner named Augustine Washington, who had traveled to London on business. They were married in 1738 and settled down on a large estate in Westmoreland County, Virginia. By all accounts, they seemed to have been very happy together, although their domestic bliss was shattered on February 11, 1743, when Augustine passed away from tuberculosis, left alone to manage a sprawling plantation and raise 6 young children. Mary quickly found herself in a position of power. As the eldest, George was only 11 years old at the time of his father's death, and he would follow Augustine into the military when he grew up. But for the time being, Mary was in charge. She ran the plantation like a business, carefully balancing income and expenses, and ensuring that everyone knew their place. Although she may not have been able to read or write, she was intelligent enough to know that she needed allies if she was going to survive. And so she turned to the women of the community for help. Theirs was a society which relied heavily on social niceties, and she couldn't do it alone. Thankfully, her neighbors were happy to assist. They assisted with childcare and household duties, and in turn, she was able to socialize freely without worrying about who would care for her children in her absence. Ultimately, she successfully navigated the societal minefield and managed to preserve her family's wealth and status. However, this doesn't mean that she was well liked. In fact, her neighbors viewed her as cold, proud, and disagreeable. They called her a terror to the neighborhood and claimed that she lived in a perpetual state of anxiety, which she projected onto those around her. For instance, she once summoned all the women of the county to a meeting and informed them that she was fed up with gossip and demanded that they stop talking about her. And yet these same people continued to talk about her for decades after she was gone. So clearly, there was something about her that made her impossible to ignore. And that something was her relationship with George. See, when Augustine passed away, he left Mary a widow at the peak of her beauty, with several eligible suitors lining up to ask for her hand. But she rejected them all, declaring that she would rather be the ugliest, poorest widow in Virginia than marry any of them. Instead, she devoted her life to raising her children, with George being her special pride and joy. Now, at first, this might seem a little odd. After all, Mary was already in her late 20s when George was born. And in a time period where women were expected to marry young, this must have seemed like an especially strange decision. But in reality, this was Mary's second act. Her entire life changed when she lost her husband, and she had to make a choice as to how she wanted to move forward. She could have accepted one of those advantageous marriage proposals and secured her children's futures, but instead chose to prioritize motherhood over everything else. Even her son acknowledged this sacrifice, writing that she gave up all thoughts of pleasure and every prospect of improvement in her condition to devote herself entirely to the care of us children. But in doing this, she also became an enabler. George had a difficult childhood. His father's death left him without a role model, and he suffered greatly as a result. He developed asthma and other respiratory problems, likely due to grief, and was plagued by insecurities for the rest of his life. Mary noticed this and tried her best to help, but her efforts ended up bad. She was strict, perhaps overly so, and insisted on obedience without explaining why. She wanted him to serve in the militia, believing that military service would give him purpose, but she never went with him to visit his ailing health. And she was too worried about what people would say, even though they were family. She wanted him to conform to the expectations of society, but never helped him develop the social skills necessary to succeed. And so he grew up feeling inadequate. She encouraged his education, but she herself was uneducated and couldn't offer him guidance in that regard. And so he grew up believing himself to be a fraud. All in all, she did her best, but because she was an imperfect person herself, her efforts ultimately failed. Ultimately, George came to resent his mother, although this is a bit ironic because he also adored her. He wanted to make her proud and believed that he did. But Mary never expressed approval, and so he spent his entire life searching for it. Even Martha Washington noted his tendency to look for a mother's blessing in her, even though Martha herself was very much a mother figure to him. So let's sum this up. Mary Ball Washington was an ambitious woman who sacrificed everything to become the best mother she could be. But in doing so, she neglected to teach her son how to navigate the world, and as a result, he grew up insecure, anxious, and seeking validation. And as he got older, he sought that validation from the American people. Sadly, Mary passed away before he was able to achieve that success. But it should be noted that her efforts did not go unrecognized. There are theories that Mary's specter haunted George throughout his life, appearing to him in dreams and waking moments, guiding him toward the decisions which made him a national hero. Whether or not this is true, we will never know. But what we do know is that George often spoke fondly of her in his later years, coming to accept that he wouldn't have been president without her. He told one reporter that he owed his career to her influence and added that he felt her presence with him at every step of his public life. In the end, Mary Ball Washington's legacy has been overshadowed by her sons. Her story has been forgotten, and she's mostly remembered as a bit of an eccentric. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Mary was a strong, independent woman who had agency over her choices. And although she didn't always make the right ones, she made them anyway. She was willing to go against the grain and blaze a trail for other women. Had she lived longer, or had she been better documented, she may have been remembered as a trailblazer. But as it is, she's known as the mother of a president. But here's the thing. Without Mary Ball Washington, there may not have been a President George Washington. So perhaps that's not such a bad legacy after all. She never held a sword. She hated bloodshed and horror. George said she turned white as death when she saw a pig killed, but she shaped the hand that held a nation's fate. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to learn more about Mary Ball Washington, I've included some additional resources for you below. This content is brought to you thanks to my generous patron. If you would like to help support this channel, please consider becoming a patron. Thank you so much for watching.